The cell, part 1. Now on this particular lesson 2, which is about the cell, it's going to be divided into 2 quizzes. Part 1 is going to be a separate quiz from part 2. So these will be separate quizzes. All right, the cell. First of all, you need to realize that God gave the shape of cells. They're not all the same shape. He gave their shape and their size and made them that way especially because of the job that he created them to do. And you can see 3 very different types of cells here pictured. And the one on the upper left is actually a neuron. That's a nerve cell. And it is shaped and designed that way to carry impulses in our body. And then on the right, the red discs, those are red blood cells. And they're biconcave because their job is actually to carry oxygen and carry carbon dioxide. And then the one that's green is found in plants. And we're going to be talking, when we study about plants, the xylem and the phloem. And xylem's purpose is to transport water with dissolved minerals up the plant. So it's more tube-like because it's shaped and designed for what God gave its function to be. So cells are made of different structures that perform different functions that keep the cell alive. And we're going to look at these little structures, which are known as organelles. Every cell has 3 basic parts. So be able to list this on the quiz, the 3 basic parts of all cells. Every cell has a boundary, otherwise where would it stop? And where would the next cell begin if it didn't have a boundary? Every cell has cytoplasm, and there's lots of things inside that cytoplasm. And every cell has genetic material. Notice that I did not say a nucleus, because not all cells have a nucleus. But all cells have genetic material, and that genetic material is DNA, which we learned in the last lesson is an essential macromolecule made of nucleotides. Okay, let's look at the boundaries. Some organisms have only one boundary, and every organism has cells that have one boundary, and that's the cell membrane. So every cell, from the tiny microscopic unicellular organisms to the giant blue whale with all its who knows how many cells that make up its body, they have a cell membrane. And that membrane is to keep in what's supposed to be in and keep out what's supposed to be out. It's also for protecting that cell. Now, a cell wall is an additional boundary that mainly plants have. There are some other organisms, even we'll get into some like the euglena, which has some structures in it that usually only plant cells have. But the cell wall, and there are some bacteria, there are some algae that have cell walls. But basically know that a cell wall is an additional boundary on a plant cell. So that means a plant cell has a cell membrane and a cell wall. The cell wall is on the outside of the cell membrane, and it's stiff. And it's a very stiff structure because of some of the molecules that are called cellulose that make it up, and that protects it. So it's added protection for that plant cell. Here's a diagram of what a cell membrane is composed of. Those funny looking things that are different colors and different shapes suspended in the 2 layers of the blue balls, those are proteins. Remember, we're studying proteins, carbohydrates, nucleic acids, and lipids. And proteins are used in the cell membrane to build it, and so are lipids. Look at all those little blue balls. Every single one is a lipid. So you can see that there are several that make up. It's called a biphospholipid layer, and you can see the 2 layers of fat cells. This is what it looks like under an electron microscope, and that's because they can magnify a lot more than a light microscope. So that's the only place you really see a thickness in a cell membrane. Usually you only see, well, there's where the cell stops, so that's the cell membrane. Cell wall, this is a diagram, of course, and you can see the outer boundary is the cell wall. Just inside of that is the cell membrane. So it has two actual boundaries. One that's not mentioned in your book is a capsule, and capsules are found mainly on bacteria, and it's on the very outside as well, and it too is a gummy, slimy type of exterior boundary. It's actually even nicknamed, sometimes they call it a slime coat because of the slimy feel when you have a lot of them together and because of the shiny appearance that they have. But they don't really talk about that. Here you can see again an electron microscope, and you can see what is labeled here, the cell wall, and you can see the thickness there, and then they call it the plasma membrane, which is on the inside. The plasma membrane is a cell membrane. This is what it looks like on the outside. To me, it sort of gives the appearance of if you've ever seen fiberglass up close. But you can see all the fibers in there, and that's a bunch of cellulose that is in the cell wall that makes it rigid. So the cell wall maintains its shape of a plant cell. And that's why a lot of plant cells are like rectangular in shape. Not all of them, but remember when Robert Hooke was looking at the cork, many of those were rectangular and they were side by side, and that's what reminded him of a prison cell, and so he called them a cell. So it is the cell wall then in a plant cell that is maintaining the shape of that cell. The cytoskeleton is what maintains the shape of an animal cell. So the boundary does not maintain the shape because it only has a cell membrane, and that's flexible. But inside it has a structure, actually several different structures connected together, that is called a cytoskeleton. And so that is what maintains the shape of an animal cell. The cytoskeleton is a network of thread-like proteins that are joined together. Here again you see the essential part of proteins. Not only are they found in the cell membrane, they also are found in the cytoskeleton. And you see the black and white picture on the right, that's from an electron microscope, where the other is just a man-made drawing to illustrate the cytoskeleton. The cell shape. Inside the cell is cytoplasm. Now this is a picture of an amoeba. This amoeba is a one-celled organism. We call it unicellular. It's a protozoan, so it's in kingdom Protista. And you can see the boundary, which has all these little extensions. Those are called pseudopodia, which means false feet. And then you can see that dark circular thing next to that brown long thing. That dark circular round thing is a nucleus. So the cytoplasm is everything from the boundary all the way up to the nucleus. So it's all this stuff inside. It is a fluid. It's more like a gel type of fluid, not solid like Jell-O, but thick substance, not just water, not real runny. And in it are suspended these little tiny organelles that we're going to talk about. That's in part 2. So the cytoplasm is fluid inside a cell that contains most of the cell's water, salts, and other molecules, and the cytoskeleton. So that's all in the cytoplasm. And it's, of course, what gives the shape. Cell types. Now, with these more advanced microscopes, scientists then started to see that there were really two different kinds of cells. There were what they called prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. We're going to look at what's the difference between these two types of cells, And you will also need to know where they are located, what types of organisms have these cells. So let's look at the prokaryotes first. The prokaryotes, which are prokaryotic cells, they are unicellular, such as what's pictured there are 2 bacteria. Now, what makes them a prokaryote? So prokaryote is really the noun, prokaryotic is an adjective. So that's the difference between those two words. Now here's what varies and what differs. In a prokaryote, which examples are bacteria, also blue-green algae is in this category. That's why it's not with the other algae. They have genetic material. You can see it listed, DNA. But they don't have a membrane surrounding it, so they don't have an organized nucleus. Their DNA is just scattered throughout and in the cytoplasm. So there's no membrane around it. And that is found, remember, prokaryotes are bacteria, blue-green algae. Those are the types of organisms. We, and all the other kingdoms other than the bacteria kingdoms, remember there's 2 bacteria kingdoms, there's the Eubacteria and the Archaebacteria. Well, all of the others, that's why, remember what the domain was named? Eukarya. Why? Because they are eukaryotes. They have eukaryotic cells, meaning they have an organized nucleus. And a lot of times it will be centrally located. This is actually not a host cell. You can see the cell, and then that real dark center thing is what is called the nucleolus. And then the boundary around that is the nucleus. So the nucleolus is inside the nucleus, and then of course all the rest of that is the stuff inside the cytoplasm. So plants, animals, fungi, protozoans, and algae other than blue-green, they're all eukaryotic cells. They are eukaryotes. They have the genetic material surrounded by a membrane. You have an organized nucleus. Every eukaryotic cell has a membrane surrounding these little tiny structures that are suspended in the cytoplasm, which we call organelles. An organelle has special functions, and that's what part 2 is going to be dealing with, where they are in the cell and what their job is in the cell. So they have these specialized functions that enable the cell to carry out different functions at the same time. The person who first named these, they looked and they reminded him of little tiny organs inside a cell. Of course, they're not organs because organs are made up of cells. But they have jobs, specific jobs like organs do. So he called them organelles instead of organs. And that's where the term came up. The genetic material you need to know in eukaryotes is a nucleus. So we're just going to be dealing now with a nucleus. So we're only going to be dealing and talking about a cell where their genetic material is enclosed by a membrane. The nucleus is the part of the eukaryotic cell that directs the cell's activities. It's, what we call like the controller. It's like the computer. Whatever it's programmed to do is what it will do. And of course, God programmed it at creation, and He programmed it by programming the DNA. And we'll learn more about how that works when we get into, I think it's the next chapter. So it directs the cell activities, and it also contains the genetic information. And that genetic information is stored in DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid. And that genetic information is what gives you all the physical and internal characteristics that you have. You got half of your DNA from mom and half of your DNA from dad to give you your genetic code, your genetic information in your nucleus, which is in every cell, with a few exceptions, like red blood cells do not have a nucleus. Now here they're showing you a diagram of a cell. They have circled the nucleus, and have enlarged it and actually shown you a real nucleus with a microscope. And in most cells, the largest organelle is the nucleus. So it usually stands out. It's very easy to see. With our microscopes, you can see even a lot of nucleoli inside nuclei. Now let's talk about how cells move. And this is not true of all cells, but we're talking mainly about the cells that are unicellular, and also they're eukaryotic cells. They usually have one of two structures on them to help with cell movement. This is a picture of a euglena. A euglena is a protozoan that lives in water, and if you look at the top end on the upper left-hand corner, you'll see faintly this structure that looks like a whip. That's called a flagellum. A flagellum is singular, flagella is plural. Now, some cells have cilia, which I'm going to show you using another cell, another unicellular organism. So those are the two main appendages that cells have that are used totally for movement. Sometimes it's the movement of the cell itself, like with this creature. It propels itself through the water. It's pretty unique to watch too, because when it whips that flagellum around, it whips it around like a propeller on a boat. Well, that causes its body then to spiral. So it looks like this green spiral football-shaped thing going through the water when you look at it moving under a microscope. Here's two organisms that are unicellular as well that have short little extensions of the cell membrane, and they're called cilia. They too are like for movement, but instead of working like a propeller, I liken it to a bunch like the Viking ship where they had a bunch of oars and they were all moving those oars together to propel the boat, and they could move it left, right, forward, backwards by controlling the movement of the oars. Well, the oars would be the cilia. The one on the left, which is purple in color, that's a paramecium, and its whole body is covered with this hair-like structures called cilia. And it's got a funny kind of movement. What it'll do is it will just go forward, and if it hits an object, it backs up, swerves a little to the right or the left, goes forward again. If it still hits the object, backs up, swerves again to one side or the other, and it keeps doing this hit and miss until it finally gets around the object. Or if the it can't get around it, I guess it just goes the other way, it gives up. Now the one I wanted you to see, that's a stentor, the one on the right. And with the stentor, you will see cilia around its mouth. That's the mouth of that cell. And the cilia are there not to propel the organism, but to move the water into the organism, because that's where its food is. It's in that water. So it beats the cilia to get the water to move inside the mouth and down into it where it can get the food out and then digest the food. So that's movement. Sometimes it's for the movement of the organism, like on the left. Sometimes it's the movement of the environment, like on the right.